Okay, everyone, welcome back. This video lecture is going to cover actually the next two modules on stratification and class issues in the United States. Here I'm going to give a brief definition and discussion of what stratification is for sociologists, talk a little bit about the issue of stratification and the trends regarding economic inequality in the United States. I'm going to talk a little bit about poverty after that and the condition of certain segments of society in the lower income brackets. Then I want to talk about briefly some changes to the work environment in the 21st century. And I want to conclude then by talking about some ideas from our good friend Karl Marx, who has a conflict-orientated position on stratification in consumer/capitalistic societies that I want to again remind you of from our previous lectures on theory, and particularly the conflict theory approach to stratification and class in a capitalistic society. I'll wrap it up and then we'll come back in a couple of weeks for another video lecture on the subject of race. So again, this lecture is covering the next two modules in this class. So with respect to a definition of stratification, you can see a good definition here. Stratification referring to structured inequality of access to rewards, resources, and privileges that are scarce and desirable in society. So really we're talking about stratification indicating access to rewards, resources, and privileges, and the understanding that some people have greater access to these rewards, resources, and privileges, and others don't. We'll break that down by those categories, race, class, and gender, as we proceed. But for now, just think of stratification as the differential access to rewards, resources, and privileges. And then beyond that, when I'm in class in a live lecture, I use the example of the students in the class and how different we all are. You think about, I know you can't see the other students in this class, but you think about the different kinds of people taking this class. How are they different? Well, they're different by a variety of indicators, by gender, by race, by class, by religious affiliation, by height or weight, or other personal characteristics we might talk about. We're all different. I like to say, kind of tongue-in-cheek, we're all like snowflakes. But the fact is, some of those differences have greater impact on our chances of success in society than others. And sociologists over the years, in the volumes of research and scholarship we've done on this subject, have shown that some of these factors, some of these differences, have more impact on us than others. So, for example, your weight or your height, or where, if you were for example born in a ghetto or barrio, or whether you were born in Highland Hills or some other high income area, these kinds of differences can set the stage for real differences in terms of these access to rewards, resources, and privileges, particularly in a capitalistic society. And the point being that some of these differences have less impact as well. So you think about characteristics like certain personality traits, or even height or weight, although it might have some bearing, for example, in a job interview, these aren't as impactful, we have found over decades of scholarship, than the more stable indicators of income, race, class, and gender, and sexual orientation even. These indicators have a greater impact, we've seen, on people's chances than some of the others. Not to dismiss other differences we have in society, but to make the point that there are some big ones. And those big ones are race, class, and gender, the next few subjects in this class. So I just want to point out that that's why we talk about stratification before we go into any detail about race, class, or gender differences, to make the point that these are forms of stratification in society, in our society, that has greater impact. There's a term that I want to mention now that's kind of a composite of these indicators, and that term is socioeconomic status, or SES. Socioeconomic status, or SES for short. You've probably heard of this expression or this term before. And what that is a composite of income, education, and occupation. So, as you might expect, wealthier people tend to be have higher education, have spent more time in college. For example, the average four-year college graduate makes about $1 million more than someone with a high school diploma. So education is strongly related to the income you're going to have later in life, and of course that has some bearing on what occupation you're going to hold. So these three income variables, education, occupation, I shouldn't say income variables, but these three variables, education, income, and occupation, we typically group together. We call it socioeconomic status, or SES, and this is a real stable marker of an indicator of how successful people are going to be. We see strong correlations between one's income, education, and occupation, or SES, with later chances at success. So I wanted to mention that as another category related to income. When we talk about stratification, we often refer to that SES. And related to stratification is another term that I know you've heard before. We're talking about social class as an indicator of some of these variables. What social class are you in? And there are different ranges. This is a slide from one version of our textbook showing, kind of breaking down by income, what class generally we're talking about. These numbers fluctuate, and I don't want to get stuck on exact numbers, but you might think of, and I'm sure you've heard of the working class versus the middle class versus the upper class. You can see some income ranges associated with those. And again, I think it's not as useful to spend our time dwelling on these different class categories, but it's worth mentioning, that we do, an economic sociologist and economist will sometimes categorize people by these income brackets into not just lower or working, middle, and upper classes, but even further into, in fact, they go as far as to talk about the lower class, the middle lower class, the upper middle class, and then the lower working middle class, the middle class, the upper middle class, and then the lower upper class, the middle upper class, and then the upper class, where we're essentially talking about the top 1% of Americans. So, it's sometimes useful to think about class categories, but I want to spend our time thinking more about the overall trends in terms of inequality in America, because the trend I want you to be aware of and to be thinking about is simply the fact that the rich are getting richer and as a smaller percentage of the population, while the middle class is shrinking and the working class, or lower class we used to say, are growing, right? So we have this sort of gravitational pull where people in the working class and the working poor are growing in number and falling behind the top 1% of income earners in America, who are, the millionaires and billionaires, in which we see a shrinking percentage belonging to that category. I'm sure you've heard of Occupy Wall Street and the phenomena of income inequality being raised by this particular group, and maybe you've heard it expressed in other forums. And and the reason why these groups have emerged is to bring attention to the fact that the 1% are growing in terms of income by leaps and bounds, while the relative numbers as a percentage of the country's population is shrinking. So that's what I mean when I say the rich are getting richer, but more concentrated at the top, and the poor and middle class are growing but falling relative in income to that 1%. That's why I say the rich are getting richer, poor are getting poor. This conversation is always a bit depressing. So I want to also include in your thought process as you think about these trends in which inequality is growing in this country, of the fact that there's also opportunity. And I want to remind you something I always say in class at this point, that everyone has opportunity. It's not to say you're not going to succeed in the world, but it's also the fact that not everyone has equal opportunity. So everyone has opportunity in America, but not everyone has equal opportunity. We need to understand how the game is rigged to support or encourage growth among the top 1%ers, and how the cards are sort of stacked against those in the middle and working classes from attaining that. There's another statistic or trend I want to mention now towards the more depressing side of things, and that's simply that about 95 to 98% of people in this country remain in the same class they were born into, making some scholars argue that we exist more in a caste system like in India, where there's no chance for social mobility, than in what we think we live in, which is a society where a class society where we can be upwardly mobile. Well, the fact is you can be upwardly mobile in this country, but it's difficult, and there are greater obstacles for some versus others. And this is why we also have to understand the fact that most people end up staying in the same class they were born into, regardless of how hard they work, regardless of factors related to personal motivation. These things matter to some extent, but essentially we remain in the class we were born into. That ladder to climb is it's a longer ladder for some versus others, so we have to understand that fact as well, while remaining optimistic that we can all be Bill Gates at some point. But I want to also be realistic and show you the facts about social mobility in the United States as presented here. And so we also want to talk about poverty in the United States, and it's more than ironic that in America, the most wealthiest country ever in human civilization, where we consume 25% of all the planet's resources and we generate them by far the greatest wealth on a global scale, we also have about the highest incident of poverty among developed Western countries on the planet. So it's the fact in this country that even though we are in the richest country ever, about 1 in 4, 1 in 5 children grow up below the poverty line, right? So we have a tremendous amount of poverty in such a wealthy country, and this is, again, is an expression of that stratification of income I talked about earlier. There's a lot of people in the poorest brackets in our society, and so naturally many of them are going to be children. One particular group are women, single moms with kids. In this country, it's a stable phenomena, in fact, that women tend to have less income than men. We'll talk about that when we talk about gender stratification and the glass ceiling and things like that, the harder chances that women have to succeed. It's coupled with the fact that they are more likely to have kids, and if there's separation or divorce or by any other means single parenthood befalls you, you're more likely to be female and have these kids, and you're earning less money on top of that. So there's this term we have, maybe I'll mention it later, but it's called the feminization of poverty, and that simply refers to the fact that women, one category of poor people are women with children in this country as a result of these other phenomena. And that's one reason why we have this really odd statistic where in the wealthiest country ever, 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 children grow up below the poverty line. It's almost shocking. And I just going to whiz through this slide. Just want to point out, if you want to see the current statistics on inequality, I've provided 3 really good sources, reliable sources, bipartisan, not politically biased, just mainstream sources of data where we can see trends in some of those charts, if you want to look at it, expressing the inequality we have in this country. And then the other thing I wanted to mention with regards to class and poverty, I've got another slide where you can check out some information on poverty among children in this country. I would particularly recommend, if you want to see a real personal look at what it's like to be a poor kid in America, this documentary Homestretch about Chicago street kids. You're going to download, if you download that, it's going to come right off my my video audio download page, and you'll see a download. The documentary will download when you click on that. It's a pretty big file, so it might get stuck, but if you can manage to download it, these are the excerpts from this really good documentary about homeless street kids in Chicago. It's really a powerful and intimate look at what it's like to actually be one of these kids living below the poverty line, homeless or semi-homeless, and then a couple other links you might enjoy as well. I also wanted to talk about some changes to the economic landscape, particularly work in the 21st century. You can see my sources. This is a great book by Jeremy Rifkin called The End of Work, and some other research by a former colleague of mine at Washington State University, Amy Wharton, who's written on this subject. And I want to say right now, you're not going to be expected to memorize, or I don't think you're even going to be tested on this particular slide, but I wanted to mention it because I know one of the reasons why, probably the main reason why you guys are in college in the first place, is to be socially and upwardly mobile, and you want to learn, I presume, something about what changes are coming your way in terms of your chances for succeeding, moving up the corporate or economic ladder, as it were. And in some of the more recent research on changes to the economic landscape of this country, I've just listed some changes that you might already be familiar with. The fact that retirement plans are diminishing, manufacturing is moving overseas, and other kind of global factors related to global changes in the economy towards high tech and service sector industries. These tend to be lower paying and tend to have less benefits. So we live in a world now where most of you, if you're not already seeing it, are going to find yourself doing sort of project-based work, or your career is going to change several times throughout your life. You might start out in one sector working for the government, let's say. Later, you might work in the private sector for an advocacy or nonprofit group, or you might go into managerial work at some level in some type of career or field. That's normative now. Workers are more flexible in where they work and what career. We have multiple careers now, I think, is a more accurate depiction of how the work life's going to go in this modern age. I think you probably already understand this and maybe have experienced it already, but it's worth knowing that it hasn't always been this way, and these changes are reflective of larger global changes to the economy that we're going to talk about in a few weeks. So I'll leave it at that for now, but I just wanted to point out we are thinking about your work experience as well as the larger trends. And then finally, I don't think we can have a full understanding of wealth and poverty in the United States without jumping back to our theoretical orientations, and particularly I want to mention the Marxist critique of capitalism and the long-standing tradition of the conflict theorist who note that the economy such as ours, a capitalistic economy, tends to work best for those who control it, for those at the top, for those who own the means of production. And there's a lot of dichotomous language here. We could talk about the haves and the have-nots. We could talk about the proletariat, which is the working class, versus the bourgeoisie, which is the upper class in Marxist terms, traditional Marxist terms, or the owners of production versus the workers. And the point about conflict theory, remember, is we're talking about a conflict of interest, and these interests are economic primarily. So those who own the means of production and who fashion the policies and procedures that guide the economy of the country would like to keep their position of power. They would like to maintain the status quo, if you will, in Marxist terminology. So their interest is into sort of keeping things structured the way they are to their advantage, and part of that process is exploiting the labor of those who are less likely to succeed in this environment. Somebody has to be exploited for those at the top to maintain their positions of power. I mean, I'm talking about that 1% and their interest in keeping them. They want to stay the 1%. Intentionally, or just as the system is rigged to do that, since they make the policies that guide these structures. And ultimately, this is why most people are unable to move up into those upper echelons of economic wealth, because the cards are stacked against them in this way. And it's intentional and purposeful from the Marxist perspective. And then beyond that, there's Karl Marx was sort of prophetic in his depiction of where American capitalism in particular was heading, and he noted the pros and cons of this economic system. And something he never gets credit for is remarking on the benefits of the system, that it does give people chances as opposed to a straight caste system where there is no chance for mobility. There is some in this country. And he was one of the first to point that out. He pointed out that capitalism tends to be, and remains, in fact, the most productive and efficient kind of economic system, as opposed to a lot of these failing socialist societies that we see all over the world today. The United States is the great producer, and we generate a lot of income. It's just not equally distributed. He also mentioned that capitalism is quite flexible and mobile. So, in this transition to the digital age or the information age that people argue we're in the midst of, capitalism has benefited from being able to adjust to the market situation more readily than a communist or socialist country can. We are adaptable, and we allow for others to make their way and to move up this ladder of economic success. Of course, he also mentioned the downside of capitalism, and I think we can examine and appreciate his points about the downside of capitalism without falling into this, this other dichotomous language of, well, you're either a capitalist or a socialist. Look, there are no purely socialist or capitalistic economic societies anywhere in the world. We're all hybrids. The United States has always had elements of socialism in its production scheme. We've got, tax-paid public schools, a police force, firemen, and we have a social security net to help people so they don't fall through the cracks. These are all socialist in their tradition. We just don't think of ourselves as having socialist, or some would call it communist, kinds of structures in our economic system. But of course we have, and we've always had that. We think of ourselves as capitalists, whether or not we are. I think the question is sort of a red herring. I think once we understand that all economic systems are hybrids, even in Russia and Red China, there's a great deal of capitalism going on in these places right now as well, just different versions of capitalism. So Marx was talking more about a critique of the American version of capitalism when he noted the downside of these of our economic system, like degrading work experiences. The reason why we're so productive is because we have this assembly line kind of factory production system, even in non-factory sectors like high tech and telecommunications. A lot of people work in cubicles, for example, and probably there's a good chance you have spent some time in a cubicle working in this system where you're doing kind of monotonous, routinized labor because it's more productive than you having a part of all different aspects of the business or company you work in, or whatever sector you work in. You're probably doing one little thing as a part of that larger system because it's more productive. The downside, of course, is it's not as rewarding as being a part of the full production cycle. So workers feel, in Marxist terms, a sense of, quote, worker alienation, unquote. That was a Marxist term to talk about how disenfranchised we are from the production system and how unrewarding and unsatisfying the jobs in an American version of capitalism can be, as we're being exploited and being paid relatively less compared to those who operate and manage these systems. So he was one of the first to mention that, and the disadvantage of being highly competitive versus cooperative systems where, for example, workers can earn a share of the stock in their company. That's sort of the antithesis of the strictly American version of capitalism. He also mentioned he was one of the first to predict real environmental degradation. If you read some of his works, Das Kapital, for example, he talks about, in at least one section, in a very prophetic way, he wrote this back in the 1800s, about how the U.S. economy would eventually strip the planet of its natural resources to the point where, since capitalism must always grow to survive and needs to produce more and more each year, ultimately we're going to hit a dead end where we run out of natural resources to provide those jobs in the economy that it sustains. So he predicted, in fact, that we would hit a wall where there comes a point where there's not enough resources to go around to sustain the need for ever-growing economies in a purely American system of capitalism. And then he also talked about the global reach of American capitalism that we're seeing today, in which we now live in a global economy, and we can't think of ourselves as an island in a sea of economies like we used to get away with. Now our economy is entirely dependent on other economies, like China, for instance, being now the largest economy, superseding the American one today. We are inextricably tied to China for our success and other countries, and recognizing that was something Marx brought to the table. And then finally, his idea about commodification. He had this term called commodity fetishism, where early on he talked about how the American economy will eventually rest on its ideals alone, where it's not even the products we produce, but our fascination with consuming that drives our economy. So other scholars have called it a post-material economy, where what we really value is what the items we purchase symbolize. We consume 25% of all the planet's goods and resources. We are heavy consumers, more than any other country. And Marx talked about this in this term commodity fetishism by saying we are actually obsessed with materialism to the point where just the image or the ideal of what things can bring us, the material kinds of things that we pursue with these jobs we work in, these incomes we make, is really the goal itself now. So it's not the product, but the idea of the product bringing happiness. The idea, it's essentially the idea that money can make us happy. And to some extent that's true, but we also know that as happiness levels in surveys we do repeatedly every so often show that people are actually less happy now than they were back in the 50s, even though we have 3 times as much stuff, shows that there is a point at which money can't buy happiness. And so we talk about the difference between a standard of living and the quality of life. And I think some of us, maybe you've thought about the fact that money, we pursue money, but is that what makes us happy? There's a lot of people talking about this as a way to kind of comprehend what it is we're striving for in these jobs we work for. Is it really all about the money, or is there something else in our lives that makes us happy? And of course we know that it is actually relationships that make us happy, up to a point. You need a certain amount of money to survive. So it's not to say that money can't buy happiness, but only to a certain extent. And so Marx was talking about commodity fetishism as kind of an overriding goal in our economy that he was very critical of, because he didn't feel like ultimately it's what makes people happy. So I've got to wrap it up now. I just need to announce that, again, this module, this video lecture is for the next 2 lectures covering class as well. I'll see you when we talk about race, class, and gender.